Welcome, everyone. So this is a lunchtime info session on the proposed stormwater fee system that the City of Hamilton is pursuing or looking into for application. And I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. As we are all in the City of Hamilton, which is situated upon the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belted Covenant, and this was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And this land was also covered by the Between the Lakes Purchase of 1792 between the Crown and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. So, welcome everyone. Stormwater fees. This has been something that I and others in Environment Hamilton have been talking about with residents around the city for many years now. And this is also a topic that goes back even before that as a topic of discussion within the City of Hamilton as something to pursue for us to address how to fund our stormwater management system, which is, of course, primarily paid for through our water bills currently. The City of Hamilton, despite our long history of debating this issue, hasn't really moved forward on it, despite a few petitions that we've started as Environment Hamilton and multiple discussions going back many terms of council. However, most recently, council did approve some guiding principles for a new stormwater fee system, which were unanimously approved by our city council recently. And the city has contracted AECOM, the consultant group, which has done a lot of work from around the country on this issue, to look at what a potential stormwater fee system could look like in the City of Hamilton. So at this session, we're going to have a presentation from AECOM staff. And then after that presentation, city staff and AECOM staff will be available to answer any questions that I, as Environment Hamilton, may have, or you as participants of this webinar may have. I will just ask for folks to hold their questions until the very end. If you are concerned that a question may slip your mind, I will flag that there is a Q&A a feature within Zoom, and there's also the chat. So you can definitely put something into the chat box, which everyone will be able to see, and I'll be monitoring that chat box to make sure that no questions go without being asked. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Michael Gregory and Nancy Hill from AECOM, and they'll get started on this presentation.
Thank you so much, Ian. I feel like you've done our presentation for us. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm Nancy Hill. You'll see also Mike Gregory. You want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Mike Gregory here. I'm an engineer. I've been doing stormwater my whole career, almost 30 years now. And Nancy and I have been doing this for quite some time, and we'd like to share some of our experience and then specifically talk about what we're looking at here in Hamilton.
Yeah, exactly. So the agenda, why are we here? Looking at Hamilton's current stormwater funding, which Ian, you already alluded to, looking at our evaluation of different stormwater funding options, what some of the other municipalities do, and then looking at incentive programs. And I'll get to that soon. So how did we get here? As you already mentioned, Ian, we kicked off this project the end of summer last year. We developed guiding principles, and the idea was that would help guide Hamilton to choose a stormwater funding model that met their needs. The General Issues Committee of the City of Hamilton endorsed the guiding principles, and we'll go through what those are. We then used those guiding principles to evaluate various stormwater funding models. We did some education sessions with council in February. We're here in May doing some stakeholder consultations. So this one with you and perhaps a couple others. And then we'll go back to council in June and say, okay, this is our recommendation, and look for their endorsement. So a brief overview of Hamilton's stormwater system. So it includes everything green and gray. They've got 1,500 kilometers of ditches, 3,500 culverts, 148 kilometers of water courses, 1,200 kilometers of storm sewers, catch basins, infiltration facilities, and 126 stormwater management ponds. So it's quite a large system. As you know, the city of Hamilton is, goes beyond the urban core. It covers the townships and the rural areas. So it's an extensive system, and it includes, as I mentioned, gray and green infrastructure. So it's quite a lot to manage there. And again, Ian, as you mentioned, Hamilton's current stormwater funding model. So in 2023, the approved budget for stormwater, $30 million will come from water and wastewater utility rates. So the idea is that properties contribute to that based on the amount of potable water they consume. And a portion of that gets used for stormwater. And then there will be about $13 million coming from property tax. And the majority of that supports the conservation authorities in the area. And some of it is also tied to road-related drainage, the culverts, ditches, etc. So one of the big issues, and again, I'll just emphasize this up here, the $30 million, the majority of it is people are contributing, property owners are contributing, or tenants based on their potable water consumption. And down here from the property taxes, properties are contributing based on their assessed value. So right now, there's not really any link between what a property contributes to stormwater management versus their load on the system. So how much drainage comes from their property and the quality of that drainage. So that's why we're looking at this. So for the stormwater funding models, we'll talk a lot about impermeable surfaces. Impermeable can also mean hard. And I'm sure a lot of you are quite educated. So, but when we're talking about impermeable surfaces, meaning water can't get through, it runs off. So we're talking about roofs, any asphalt, concrete, compacted gravel that gets driven on. And pavers, unless they're designed for infiltration, are impervious. So this is what breaks up the natural water cycle. So, when it was all forested and water would hit the trees, and a lot of it would get intercepted and soaked up by the trees, evapotranspiration, and soaked into the ground and recharge aquifers. With impermeable surfaces, that doesn't happen anymore, and we break the natural water cycle. So that's what we're kind of focusing on, is trying to address that, because that's what then the city needs to then manage, because it runs off into the city's stormwater system. And as I mentioned before, that includes gray and green infrastructure. So those guiding principles that I referred to way back when we came up with 5 guiding principles, and how we developed these were based on previous work the city had done, looking at the city's OCP and other things to make it consistent with the other work. And these were then endorsed by council. So we are using these to assess different stormwater funding models. So the first one being fair and equitable, and making it a user pay system. So if we go back to the water utility, properties contribute to the water system, treating water, distributing water, potable water, I should say, based on the amount of water they consume. So it's kind of a user pay system. The more you use, the more you pay. Right now, that doesn't apply to the city of Hamilton's current stormwater funding model. So can we come up with something that is more fair and equitable? The second one is providing a stormwater funding model that allows the city to become more resilient to climate change, and also to better support the natural environment, the creeks, the harbor, etc. Third one is a model that is affordable and is also financially sustainable. And what I mean by financially sustainable is that the city it provides long-term funding, so the city can plan for long-term projects to support its system. It's also a type of system where you're not just kicking the can down the road, you're not burdening future generations with the cost of maintaining the system. Is that everyone contributes and goes along, and it's not something where all of a sudden you're going to hit a day where you've run out of money. It's financially sustainable for the long term. The fourth one is it's a justifiable system. So you can justify it to residents. You can justify it to the courts if you need be. So it's legally relevant. And finally, something that is simple to understand. So again, people can understand the system, and it's also simple to manage, to implement and to manage on an ongoing basis. You don't want a system where half the revenue that comes in is paid to manage the system. So those were the 5 guiding principles that we used. Here's a long list of funding options that we evaluated, the 7 of them, and they sort of go from simplest to say, I don't want to use the word complicated, but they are, it's a little more to it. But it also sort of increases, whereas the simplicity decreases, the equity increases. So the first couple are based on assessed value. You can have just general taxes, or you could have a dedicated tax levy. Then we've got the water wastewater rate. So as you can see, the top 3 is where the city of Hamilton, how they currently fund stormwater. Then you get to 4, 5, 6, and 7, all look at various stormwater rates, sometimes referred to as utilities, particularly in the States, where you're trying to develop some kind of relationship between the amount of runoff a property generates versus how much they contribute to stormwater funding. So again, you could have a tiered flat fee. Well, the simplest is actually the city of Calgary that just says it's just flat fee, which every property pays the same. Then you get some municipalities that will say, okay, no, residents pay 200 a year, non-resident properties, ICI, pay 750, and you can break it up into various tiers. Then you get into what's called an equivalent residential unit. And these next 5, 6, 7, how it does is it sort of treats residential one way, and those are usually the bulk of the properties. It treats non-residential differently, where it actually measures using aerial photography what an industrial, commercial, institutional property pays based on their actual impervious area. And the difference between 5, 6, and 7 is how we treat residential properties. So 5 says, let's keep it simple. 80% of the properties are residential. Let's have them all just pay the same. And then number 6 says, well, that's not quite fair. You have condos, you have single family dwellings. So number 6 says, okay, let's have different residential types pay different amounts, but they're the same within their type. So all single family dwellings pay the same. All condos pay the same. And so if the average condo has half the size of a single family dwelling, then condos pay half what a single family dwelling would pay. And then the next one, 7, says, well, wait a second, why should a bungalow pay the same as a huge mansion? So they say, okay, well, let's develop tiers within the residential, and let's have a small, medium, and large. So anyways, just it can be quite complicated, but just to let you know that, you break up in granularity as you go down the list, increases with equity, but as I said, increases or decreases in simplicity. So what does that look like? So we took those different stormwater funding models and assessed it against the guiding principles. And the red empty circle basically says it does not support that guiding principle at all. The hatched yellow circle says, well, it kind of does. And then the green circle is, yes, it definitely supports that guiding principle. So this is sort of a nice visual tool, and you can kind of see where which stormwater funding models best support the agreed upon guiding principles. And those are the ones lower down on the list where we're trying to approximate the runoff from a property and apportion that to how much they should contribute to stormwater funding. So I just remind you here, an ERU is where all residential properties pay the same. SFU is where all single family dwellings pay the same, and multi-residential would pay a fraction of that. And tiered single family, tiered SFU is where we break up the single family dwellings and we distinguish between a small house and a large house. Okay. So what do these different property types look like? These are some examples of what we found in the city of Hamilton, and I apologize if I've happened to pick one of your homes, but these are, so when we talk about single family dwellings or detached homes, this is what, a small one we found, a medium one that we found in the city of Hamilton, and a large one. So again, do we ask them to all pay the same, or do we break them up into different tiers? We also pulled out one that we've got homes that are within the urban boundary and those that are outside in rural areas. So you can see the ones in rural areas, they tend to have, the house might be just sort of a typical medium house, but they tend to have longer driveways. So, and again, for impervious surface, we don't just count the building footprint, we also count other hard surfaces like asphalt. Then down here, we've got a bunch of multi-residential type. So we've got a semi-detached home, we've got a linked home. There are lots of different categories. If you've ever been involved in development, we've got townhomes, multiplexes, we call multifamily here or apartment. And those are typically where you've got one owner for the apartment building and then rentals. And then we've got condos. And this is where each unit tends to be owned by a different property owner. So these are all the different residential types. So again, if I go back to what I called the ERU, the simplest one is everyone would pay the same under the ERU. Under the SFU, these single detached homes, small, medium, large, would all pay the same. And so the upper row would all pay the same, and the lower row would pay, each unit would pay a fraction thereof. And if I go for the tiered single family, tiered SFU, then everyone would pay a different amount. So this small home would pay less than this medium home, which would pay less than this large home. Hope I've confused everyone sufficiently. So we went and did a parcel analysis of the different residential housing types in the city of Hamilton to get a sense of, well, how much do we need to worry about these different types? Like, are there a lot of them? And what we found is that of the of the residential properties, so I think we have 88% of the properties are residential. And of that, 83% are single family dwellings. So again, we're dealing with them, that's the majority of them. But then the city of Hamilton also has a lot of multi-residential properties. And so we went out and we sampled them and we said, well, what is the actual difference between the amount of hard surface for these different residential types? Do we need to break them up? How important is this? And so on the last column here, you will see how many we sampled. And so what we did was we took aerial photography and we actually measured the impervious area of these different residential types. And just to get a sense of, where do we need to break these groups up into different classes and how critical is it? And this is what we found for the single family dwellings. So the average single family detached home, if you look at urban rural combined, the average home average property has 312 square meters of impervious area. The median though, and if for those who are involved in statistics, is 263. So what this means is there are actually quite a few large homes that are sort of skewing the average. And if we look at the 10th percentile, the 90th percentile, so you've got the 10 smallest and the 10% largest, there's quite a big gap. It goes from 160 to 470. So there's a ratio of 3 from the largest homes to the smallest homes. So that was quite interesting for us. Then we said, well, let's look at the difference between within the urban boundary and outside the urban boundary. So inside the urban boundary and outside being the rural areas. And the average home was 291 in terms of hard surface. So that's including the driveways, sheds, house, etc. And outside the urban boundary was 596. So it's about we found twice as much impervious area in homes in rural areas. The ratio was quite similar. So within the urban boundary, when we look at the 90th percentile versus 10th percentile, so the top 10% and the lowest 10% was about 3, and in the rural areas, 3.1. So quite similar. So there is quite that large range between the large and the small. So how does Hamilton compare to other municipalities? So we compare, we've done similar analyses in other municipalities, and taking a look at how large so when we look at the medium home, how large it is. So Hamilton is quite large. So the only that we've measured. Sault Ste. Marie is a bit larger, a little more of a rural community. Thunder Bay is close. When you look at the ratio between the largest homes and the smallest homes, and that ratio of 3, again, that is quite large. Ottawa had quite a big spread of the large and the small. They're similar to Hamilton, where they've had this big agglomeration between the urban core and these townships and rural areas. Thunder Bay was quite large, but Hamilton is quite a lot of large homes and quite a huge spread between the largest and the smallest. So then we start looking, okay, well, what's realistic for a storm, to contribute for stormwater funding? So these are some municipalities that have implemented a stormwater rate. And what are they asking their average home to pay? This is per year. Often homes will get charged on a monthly basis. So it would be divided by 12. But so as you can see, it kind of ranges from $84 to $216. So we're looking at somewhere between, sort of $13 to $18 or $19 a month towards stormwater management for the average home. So if the City of Hamilton were to implement something, it would obviously, look at this and compare against that and make sure it was in line. And then we're going to take a look at, well, what do we need to support? What does the Stormwater Fund need to support? So as I mentioned, the 2023 approved budget, it's got $30 million that comes from the water wastewater utility. Another $9 million gets pulled from taxes to go towards the Conservation Authority, and almost another $4 million gets pulled from taxes to go to roads related maintenance. So the entire program right now is for the 2023 approved budget is $43 million. However, there are some projects, and Hamilton has been in the news a bit about some things that need to be done. And so for 2024 and 2025, the budget increases to $49 million. This is the forecasted budget, and 2025 is $54 million. So again, the increases mostly come from the water wastewater utility. So again, properties would be supporting the budget based on their potable water consumption. Okay. One topic I wanted to bring up was financial incentives, and I think this is something that is dear and near to many of you. And the idea is that when a stormwater rate is implemented, a lot of times it is implemented along with financial incentives. And there are a variety of forms of financial incentives. The first one is a credit. And what that is, it's an ongoing reduction in the stormwater fee. So if a property says, okay, yes, I have 200 square meters of impervious area, but I have an infiltration gallery and I infiltrate the first 25 millimeters rainfall into the ground. So the stormwater rate can provide a means to say, okay, you get a credit. In other words, a reduction in your stormwater fee for implementing that. There are other ways to provide financial incentives. So it could be you get, it's a reduced cost to implement a rain barrel, for instance, for homes. It could be, here's some money towards constructing a rain garden, or some municipalities partner with a third-party nonprofit that goes around to properties and provides them with the information and the support to implement measures such as rain gardens on site. And so that's been quite successful in Kitchener and Waterloo, for instance. And so there are a variety of ways to provide financial incentives to encourage property owners to manage stormwater better on site, beyond just the fee component. And so this is something that the City of Hamilton would, is interested in and would look at. And so the idea is that you want it to be fruitful, the financial incentives, but you don't want it to cost too much to administer. And so the only concern, and some municipalities do provide credits for residential programs, for residential properties. The only, as we saw on the previous slide, when a residential property is paying maybe $15 a month to provide a discount of 33%, that's $5 a month, is how much of that can really provide the economic incentive to, saving $5 a month, is that enough to support the construction of something on site? And also if 88% of your properties are residential, and, even at 10% of them want to participate, that's a lot of credits to administer. So it's finding the balance between, maybe, so a lot of municipalities will say, okay, we offer credits for non-residential properties. Those are the ones that, might pay $2,000 a year. So it's a little more economically viable and justifiable to have a credit program. And for the multi-res, maybe we instead have, we partner with a third party, and they help support the construction of rain gardens and other on-site measures. And it's just something that is less administrative. So anyways, lots of stuff to think about there. And that's something that the City of Hamilton, should they decide to go down this path, will need to sort out. So next steps, because I want to leave lots of time for questions. So today we want to hear your questions and any feedback, and look forward to that. May and June will be busy for us. So as I showed, we did a lot of sampling of residential properties. Currently, we are doing measurement of the non-residential. So ICI, so industrial, commercial, institutional, mixed use, and also high-rise properties. Measuring them individually. We will then be going to council first committee, and then it's followed up by a council meeting June 28th. And then we'll be looking for council endorsement to implement a stormwater rate structure. Or we're looking for their endorsement for whatever structure they wish to implement. So that's next steps. It'll be a lot of work between now and then, but now we're open to your questions. And Ian, I don't know if you want to say anything or.
No, thank you so much, Nancy. I could ask you questions for the rest of the day. But one thing that I really value from this presentation, your framing of as simplicity decreases, equity increases, I think is applicable to this, but also a lot of other things that the City of Hamilton undergoes. So I think I really thank you for that. As I said, I could ask questions all day, but we have a number of folks I think are sharing their questions in the chat. So I'll read that out. I will also just flag, if anyone is on the call and would like to just ask your question yourself, feel free to raise your hand and I'll get to you. But first, looking at the chat, from Carol Moffat, doesn't reduce potable water use for watering gardens because of mitigation measures also provide an incentive. This should be emphasized. If Nancy or Michael, you'd like to respond to that.
Michael, you're nodding. Do you want to respond to that?
Okay, sure. There can be incentives that affect both the water supply side of things and the disposal of water, the stormwater. And so what we did in City of Guelph And by the way, that slide makes me laugh. That's a joke slide. It's a bit of a satirical slide. This is when we were doing the City of Guelph credit program. They were trying to decide what was the best financial incentive program for the residents of City of Guelph. And we looked to, at that time, Kitchener had a residential credit program where they gave 9% credit for a rain barrel. And the joke was, well, if I had 14 rain barrels wrapped around my house, you're going to owe me money, right? So it's a bit of a joke. In any case, the City of Guelph had conservation programs for that very thing. They wanted to encourage water conservation, and they had financial incentive programs already in place. And so the point was, let's not duplicate any effort or anything, but let's focus on those existing rebate programs and not include them in the stormwater utility or stormwater rate credit program. So it's very important to coordinate with strategic initiatives already in place.
Thank you, Michael. And then from Trevor in the chat, I see,
Mhm.
are the driveways, regardless of whether they are asphalt or gravel, would be considered impervious? Looked like driveway in a rural property was a significant factor.
Yeah. So often, if someone has a gravel pathway, it can actually be quite good for increasing perviousness, and people can design gravel systems to help water percolate into the ground. However, once gravel is driven on many times, we find it gets compacted and it acts like an asphalt. So the general rule of thumb is that gravel that serves a roadway function is considered impervious and is a hard surface. If you're talking about gravel pathways through a forested area, that's okay. So that is generally in other municipalities how they have distinguished between impervious and pervious area for gravel, if that makes sense.
Thank you, Nancy. And then I see, the questions are really coming in now. So from Carolyn, because of the great variance in impermeable surfaces amongst homes in Hamilton, would that not point to the tiered SFU model as most appropriate for Hamilton?
Yeah. So from an equity perspective, it would. Up to SFU, it's fairly easy to administer the model because you take the coding, we call MPAC, so the assessment authority. You sort of, all the homes are categorized, and you sort of just pick them up based on their category and you throw them in the bucket. So it's quite easy. Once you get to, let's do some tiering of the single family, so call them small, medium, large, then you have to do some measurements, and it becomes that going from SFU to tiered SFU is where there's a bit of a jump in administrative work. And Hamilton is quite large and has quite a few properties. So definitely from an equity point of view, exactly, it appears the most appropriate. Is a bit of a jump in administrative work. Not impossible. A lot of municipalities do it. Mississauga does it. So then it becomes that balance. And do you want that extra administrative work for that extra level of equity? And that's something that council will need to decide on.
And then next from Juliana, will AECOM be reviewing best practices and providing recommendations to council on a credit and or incentive program or element to this?
So it would probably, for June, it would be the level of detail would be a recommendation to consider or not consider a credit incentive program. And then if the council decided to go ahead, then it would be looking at, okay, what would that credit program look like? So the credit program wouldn't be finalized by, what a credit model wouldn't be finalized by June. It would be more of a recommendation. Let's look at financial incentives. And then that would allow more time in the summer and the fall, if it went ahead, to work with stakeholders and say, okay, what could the financial incentive program look like?
Thank you, Nancy. And then question from Nancy, another Nancy. with two back to back, but the first one is a good one because I've heard this question a lot too.
Mhm.
In rural areas that have a stormwater fee, I've heard complaints that barn roofs and other agricultural buildings are charged even though the water ends up in the ground. What do they do for rural areas in other cities that have rural areas? I'm thinking Ottawa perhaps is
Mhm.
a good
Mhm.
example for that.
Mhm. 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 Yeah. There really is, when it comes to stormwater funding, there really is no one size fits all, and different municipalities have approached rural areas in different ways. Some municipalities have given them their own category and have charged them a different amount. Um, Sometimes it's less than urban areas. Sometimes they've said, we're not going to charge rural areas at all. Some of them have said, we will charge the same as urban areas, even though, so for instance, a rural home would maybe get charged the same in some areas as an urban home, even though they have a larger footprint, but in consideration of items such as this. If And then there are other municipalities that say, well, if it depends what the rural area. If it's just a home, then a farmhouse, then that's fine. A farmhouse with a garage or whatever. If it's an actual operating farm, then they tend to get pulled out and analyzed separately because there are some agricultural areas that might have a lot of greenhouses, for instance, and some agricultural areas, properties that are actually have a lot of buildings. So some some municipalities decide to actually, so for those that aren't just a farmhouse, they will actually analyze them on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you, Nancy. And then the follow-up question there, and I'm thinking of, Mississauga as an example for this one potentially. Would the program be able to fund the extra staff time for the extra work needed for the tiered SFU system? And I guess I would just add to that myself. We understand ultimately this is about generating revenue for the projects needed for the system, but have other cities that have pursued that more complicated measure been able to not only sustain the infrastructure costs, but also the staffing costs?
Yeah, so generally a stormwater rate would be self-funding. So it funds the projects and funds the administrative cost to run that rate. Yeah.
Okay, great. And then I have another question from Pascal. The city of Hamilton has a grant of up to $2,000 to disconnect downspouts from the stormwater system. There are quite a few homes in the city that remain connected. How would downspout connection to the stormwater and combined sewer system be taken into account, if at all?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that's one of the ideas, and John can add his information too. I think the idea too is that there are a lot of different programs out there, from rain barrels to downspout disconnection. And this is potentially, if there was sort of a stormwater utility, let's say, you could sort of wrap that all together and provide a more coherent, coordinated approach. And so maybe the downspout disconnection system becomes a part of that stormwater utility, and it's one of the features of one of the financial incentives, and so yeah, you would want to coordinate that somehow, and that's something that would need to be looked at. Same with the rain barrel program and any other stormwater related programs in the city. So
John, did you want to weigh in on that?
So I'm John Savoy. I'm a senior policy advisor for the city of Hamilton Finance. Like Nancy suggested, there are a number of existing programs out there, and that what we need to do is, include that as part of the communication when we get once we move forward with some of these incentive programs. Is that we already have programs that provide subsidies in that. They may in turn now be maybe partially funded by the storm rate, because right now they're being funded from the water and wastewater rates. So there has to be coordinated in there, and other considerations when we get into downspout disconnections. There are a number of other issues. A lot of properties are not connected to the Weepern system just because of the when they were built. But then there's other issues that we know exist that disconnecting the downspout may just cause problems with your neighbor, depending on how the water gets routed. So that would be something more where I think working with someone like a Green Venture and have them, because they could, I guess, more properly help and assist residents in if they're considering downspout disconnection. So I think it would be tied back into working with the new incentive programs. How do we incorporate some of what we already are doing? And the same thing goes with rain barrels. We've had an annual rain barrel sale for probably close to 15 years now. But Green Venture also has rain barrel sales. So like, can we not coordinate that together? And so that way there, we reduce duplication of effort and the city maybe promote it and help subsidize it through this funding and let Green Venture do the delivery of the program. So that will definitely be part of the conversation that would happen this summer should council support the recommendations of the report coming in late June.
Yeah, and before we move on to the next question, I'll also just flag that I feel like we're also getting to some concerns I've heard from some city councilors who may be watching this as a recording in the future, that there are a lot of commercial properties that have implemented measures on their properties to reduce stormwater runoff already. And so what I'm hearing is that all these things will be considered, which is always the concern from many that something will fall through the cracks. And then following up from Juliana, I noticed a credit/incentive program cost forecasted in the 2025 budget. It was 1.574 million for a new program. What does this refer to?
Yeah, so the direction, and there was a motion by the General Issues Committee from Council that said they wanted us to come forward in June or by Q2 of 2023 with a recommendation for a stormwater funding model that could be implemented in 2025. So what we're presenting in 2025 is a possibility of what that would look like. So if they went ahead with the model and there was a credit incentive program, et cetera, this is what it could look like in 2025.
I can elaborate on that too. And before I do, I want to distinguish. I was very deliberate when I talked about financial incentives. There's two types, basically. A rebate is a one-time thing. You got a downspout disconnect, here's a check for $2,000, don't apply again. You got whatever. So that's a rebate, a one-time payment. Whereas a credit, specifically in our terminology, a credit is an ongoing reduction off your base charge. Now, so that's on every bill for 3 years, however long the period is. That represents unrecognized revenue. And so if we give credits away for your low impact development facility here, your cistern system there, it's your pond over there, those things amount to unrecognized revenue. So the rate has to make up that money. So a big chunk of that estimated $1.6 million is for that unrecognized revenue to make up the stormwater rate generated revenue. In addition, there's staff time involved to go in and follow up on these credit applications and check up on these things to approve, et cetera. And so that's separate in that line item. You see 1.6 million, and then the administrator just for the rate itself. So managing the database, making sure all the money for stormwater is collected and goes to where it needs to go, et cetera. So those are additional costs on top of the accounting system at the city. Whereas we're trying to be very specific on the credit/incentive, financial incentives, estimated budget. So I hope that it gives a lot of detail on where we came up with that number.
Okay, moving on. We have just a little over 10 minutes and questions are still rolling in. Coming up from Zoe. Would there be a distinction between runoff that makes its way into a nearby waterway versus runoff that goes into the sanitary system to a wastewater treatment plant? These have fundamentally different impacts.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this has been brought up by city staff. So we have looked at this, and possibly it would add another sort of layer of analysis and administration, and whether this would be considered in the rate itself or more likely, this was also asked about in terms of the financial incentive program. So in combined areas versus separated areas, would there be a different financial incentive program that would try and target different things, because you might have different priorities in different areas. So it is possible. It would add an extra administrative layer. So that's one thing we'll have to look at.
Thank you. And then what sort of differences in, oh, sorry, this is from Nancy. What sort of differences in fees are currently found in cities with a stormwater funding model between, say, a Walmart parking lot and a residence? Basically, how much approximately would Walmart or a similar type store pay per year? And I'll maybe add to this, because we do have a lot of unmanned parking lots as well that don't have any water hookup as well. So maybe we could do the commercial that has some water, the parking lots that have absolutely no water service, and then residential.
Well, that's exactly, and you brought an excellent point. So currently a parking lot that doesn't have a water hookup would contribute very little to stormwater management. And so the idea behind those three rates, the ERU, SFU, and tiered SFU, the idea is that you take the average single family dwelling and you say that's one billing unit. So whatever that billing unit is, you say it pays that much. And then a parking lot that would have 4 times the impervious area of your average single family dwelling, they would pay 4 times as much. Or if it had 10 times the average impervious area of a single family dwelling, they pay 10 times. Like it's a very sort of black and white calculation that way. So yeah, are there some properties in other cities that pay thousands and tens of, malls that will pay tens of thousands? Yes, that does exist in other cities. So it's very much a 10x the impervious area, 10x the fee, without considering financial incentives. Definitely.
If I could add, Ian,
Please.
in the June report, there will be some profile analysis of where we'll try and compare, the average residential water user, what is their water, what is their before and after, essentially what is it they're paying in water, wastewater in 2025, or we project to be, and then what would they be paying between water, wastewater, and the storm fee, and then similarly properties that are not connected to there, and various profiles of water users. So a heavy, high user industrial customer versus an institutional customer versus a small commercial customer, and then because on the one side you got their water use if they are connected to the water use, and then on the other side it's going to be more around their built form and their measure of impermeability that will give their after picture. So that is intended to be included in the June report.
Great, thank you to you both. I'm not seeing another question in the chat. Again, if anyone wants to raise their hand and ask a question, definitely feel free. I have a question though. Nancy, early in the presentation, you laid out the principles, and one of those principles is justifiable. I was just wondering, the thought that came to my head when you said justifiable and you said legally justifiable was the legal challenge that happened in Mississauga. I was just wondering if you could maybe speak to that, and maybe, just for anyone who's maybe on the call or watching this recording, worried about, the idea of a legal challenge, and maybe talk about what it would, how it would be justifiable legally.
And I'll let Mike speak to this too. There have been more legal challenges in the States than there have been in Canada, but there are also a lot more stormwater utilities in the States than in Canada. We do have a few case challenges that have come up in Canada, and so it can be sometimes it's around institutions, whether they pay, and sometimes it has to do with the different tiers of government. So federal and provincial entities, do they have to pay a municipal fee? So that is something that the lawyers get to hash out, and generally, the closer it matches to a user pay principle, a stormwater rate, the more legally justifiable it is, the more sound, the better argument you'll have if you do get pulled to court. So as you can see, when you get to the tiered rate where you say, okay, all all ICI, you just all pay $500 a year. You do tend to open yourself up to challenges more. And the closer you kind of, where you're actually quantifying how much runoff, how much hard surface and therefore how much runoff, you probably have a better case if you do get pulled to court. The other thing I will mention too is that with any, for any stormwater rate, there's typically a challenge process. So for instance, let's say someone gets charged a fee, a property, and they say, what, you charged me as a duplex? I'm not a duplex, I'm a, this. There is always a process where you can put in your, claim, and you show them your whatever and say, this is what my property is, or you consider this parking lot, this doesn't belong to me, it's actually the neighbors, and that property actually belongs to them. There is always that process or typically most municipalities will put that process in place to allow for any challenges with, things happen, right? Or something changes on your property and the impact code hasn't been updated, etc. So there's the challenge process, which is generally just, filling out a form and getting your fee recalculated. And then there's the sort of who has the right to charge who and going to courts kind of thing. And often that has to do with sort of federal, provincial, municipal authorities challenging one another. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Oh, no, it certainly does. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'm not seeing any additional questions, and it's 12:56 now. So I think that's a good spot to wrap it up. So before I end the recording, I just want to thank, City of Hamilton. Just so for folks who are aware, City of Hamilton approached Environment Hamilton to host this, and we were, of course, more than happy to. Thank you so much, Nancy and Michael, and John in particular, for weighing in on these questions in particular. For everyone who's on the call, I hope you all stay engaged and watch how this process unveils with City of Hamilton. Environment Hamilton will certainly be continuing to advocate for this program to continue. And I just want to thank everyone for joining us. And the recording will be shared probably sometime tomorrow. And then as well, just a quick question, Nancy, if someone were to request, could we share these slides with someone if they wanted to see them for future reference?
I think, Katie, what was going to be the process with the slides? Were we going to send them?
Yeah, we could send them if somebody wanted to see them. That's fine.
Perhaps we can send them to Ian, and then Ian can post them on their website. That might be the more efficient way of doing it.
That sounds good to me. So thank you so much, everyone. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their afternoon. And I'm stopping the recording now.